know who you are?
Well, I've been looking forward to this because, while I want to share some kind of broad themes with you, I'm also going to be somewhat autobiographical today. And here's why. I went to seminary in 1952 and was ordained in 1955. So I have lived through a period in the life of our Lutheran Church in this country where I've seen a lot of change and where I have changed. And I'll tell you some about that too. And in reflecting on this, I thought, gee, I wonder if that would be of interest to a lot of people to say, oh, how is the Lutheran Church different than it was 60 years ago or more than 60 years ago? Some of you have lived through that, some of you haven't, except the latter stages. As I was preparing this, I thought, yeah, boy, some of what I'm going to talk about, if they had a young crowd here, would be ancient history. But I think you people will be a little more understanding. And talking to Sue Swing about what I wanted to do, she suggested I have a kind of an introduction which shares, and that's one of your handouts there, how we got to be the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You know, so when we talk about how the Lutheran Church changed, what are we talking about? And so the outline is very brief. It really starts out with World War II. And I'm not talking here about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod or the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. They are distinctly different. They have been, they still are, and the things I'm going to say about a voice, public voice, and social justice just don't apply to those churches. So we're talking here about the branch of Lutheranism of which we're a part, and which St. Matthew's has been a part from its inception. So there were, after World War II, 8 different Lutheran churches in this country, and I have them outlined there. In 1960, 4 of them, well, 3 out of 4 merged in 1960. They're the American Lutheran Church, which was mostly German, Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was mostly Norwegian, and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was mostly the Danes. And my friend Harry Anderson always wanted to be sure we knew they were the gloomy Danes, and not the happy Danes. He being a Dane himself, obviously identifying with the happy Danes. And then there was another Norwegian, when I say they're this background, that means mostly, because in this country, obviously, it had become mixed. In 1963, the Lutheran Free Church, which had Norwegian origins, also joined the ALC. So by 1963, here are these 4 churches, now one, in what became known as the, capitalized the, Lutheran Church, the American Lutheran Church. Well, in 1962, 4 other churches came together and formed the Lutheran Church in America. Yeah, the terminology is confusing, but it's part of our history. And these 4 were the United Lutheran Church America, which was largely German background, but I'd say less ethnic than the others because it was heavily concentrated on the East Coast and had been here ever since the early 18th century. And so it had become more Americanized than I'd say the other Lutheran churches, and its German heritage was not quite as significant as these others. Then the Augustana Lutheran Church, mostly Swedish, and then the American Evangelical Lutheran Church, and this was the happy Danes that Harry always talked about. And then the Suomi Synod, which was of Finnish background and heavily up in the Upper Peninsula and northern Wisconsin and very heavily across the northern part of our country. So these came together in 1962 to form the Lutheran Church in America, and I was privileged to be a delegate to that assembly and see it happen. It was pretty exciting. Now, these two churches, ALC and the LCA, grew closer and closer together as the years went by. And also, a new thing happened in the 1970s. The Missouri Synod had a fracture, and a group broke off and called themselves the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. And their stimulus was to say to the ALC and the LCA, why don't we all get together in one church? And so where the ALC and the LCA had been kind of dancing with each other but not getting together fully, finally the AELC, these former Missouri Synod people, brought us together, and it happened in 1987 that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America was formed. And of course, St. Matthew's belongs to that, and I should have said St. Matthew's belonged to the LCA before that and to the ULCA before that. So that's, when I talk about this history, you have some idea of St. Matthew's coming through the process too. Okay, that's a quick run through. Is it okay? Is it understandable to at least get the bare outline? You don't have to know all the ins and outs. Okay, now to the real task at hand, which is what I started out wanting to share with you. This is that starting with the period right after World War II and before, the Lutheran Church had a strong sense of social ministry, but it was a service-oriented kind of understanding, so that the task of the church in the name of Christ was to reach out and help individuals in times of need. And this is early on in the Lutheran Church, strong emphasis in Germany, for instance, and other European countries before people came over here. And so we were good at forming organizations that helped to do this. Service organizations which eventually kind of merged and became known as Lutheran Social Service, multi-service agencies, or homes for orphans or older people, and that kind of direct service was very much a part of the Lutheran tradition. And we saw this as Christ-given responsibility. We saw it as the way we carried out our social mission, if you want to call it that, in society. And that's all to the good, and that's a strong and valued part of our heritage. But when you search Scripture fully, you realize that's only part of the task. And that's where I'm going to go now. Well, what about the rest of the task? Where'd that come from? How come we now speak publicly and want to act publicly, where before, that's not something the Lutheran Church did. I mean, when I was ordained, and in my background up to that point, I thought this was how we served people. We did these direct service kinds of things. And my ministry in the first few years out of seminary was counseling people, helping them find the services they need, speaking to those concerns and so on. But not addressing issues that were very important in the larger society. That wasn't really part of my training or my thinking or the church's thinking. I recall somewhere there in the late 50s discussing these things with a growing realization, maybe it was more to the task than I realized, with a good pastoral friend of mine who was smarter than me, and better educated. He ended up getting a PhD. We were discussing this, and I said something about where is the Lutheran social ethic? And he said, the Lutheran Church doesn't have a social ethic. Now, that made quite an impression on me, obviously, because I still remember it all these years later. And so, in part, what I'm talking about today is how the Lutheran Church came to get a social ethic, recognize that it's an important part of our whole witness, and act on it. So that's kind of where things started out. And as usual, please stop me and ask questions or make comments if you feel you want to. That's fine. And I'm not wearing my glasses so that I can see my notes, and so I may not see you right away, so I just kind of put your hand. I have to make a choice. It's either or. If I see you well, I don't see the notes well, so I'm going with the notes. One of the things, it's an old story, but you may have heard it, and that is that there was a town that was on a river in an unnamed place, and the people began to notice in that town that every so often a dead body floated down the river, and they were very concerned about it. They always fished the bodies out of the water, and in compassion saw that the body got a decent burial. And this went on for several years until finally they got some new leadership in the town. And the leaders said, these bodies keep floating down the river, and we take care of burial, but we never investigate why they're floating down the river in the first place. We need to do something about that. And so they organized themselves and they marched upriver to put an end to the floating bodies. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. The church was very good at fishing people out of the stream and doing what was necessary, but not very good at checking into why are these things happening and what can we do about that. That's what I mean by a public voice when I say how the Lutheran Church got a public voice. Addressing those larger issues that cause the problems in the first place, and trying to do something about that. So that's where I'm going. And there are going to be 6 influences that I talk about this week and next. 3 this week, 3 next if I get through the 3 today. And the first one, which was very significant, was the aftermath of World War II. It wasn't only the military involvement that we had in World War II that influenced things here. It was the learnings that came out of what had happened in Europe, which I think most of us, now I was a youngster growing up, so I got a good excuse, but I think most Americans really didn't know the full story of what happened in Germany until after the war. And it was with the realization of the horrors that had occurred there that new light dawned. And the fact that this happened in a country that up until World War II had been thought to be one of the most progressive countries in the world, one of the most humane countries in the world, one of the most knowledgeable countries in the world, and to descend into Nazism with wide acclaim and support afterwards seemed almost unreal. Now, I'm only going to hit some highlights, obviously, but from the perspective of the Lutheran Church, what happened was when the Nazis first came into power, both the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church and the Reformed Church, but the Lutherans and the Catholics were the most influential, just kind of went along with it and thought, oh yeah, here's a new opportunity for our country. But there were those who said, this is not only anti-Christian, this is stuff that has to be opposed. This is completely apart from our theology. And so they gathered together and they formed a small, what would you call it, counter church, which they called the Confessing Church. We confess that we believe in one God and in our Lord Jesus Christ, etc. And here are the implications of that.
And are you talking
Yes.
about the American Lutheran
No,
Church?
no, I'm
or
talking about the German church.
Oh, the German
The
Church.
German church. When the Nazis in the middle 30s kind of revealed their true colors, that's when this confessing church came into being. Because along with the social aspects of what the Nazis wanted to do, they were also promulgating a whole new theology. And if you recall in reading history, they were talking about the Germans being the master race. And Deutschland über alles, Germany over everybody. And they were pushing the church. They wanted to create a national church which promulgated these values and their subsequent attitudes toward other people. So this confessing church organized to oppose that, and a couple of the Lutheran standout names were Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, Martin Niemöller, not so well known, but Niemöller was an officer in the German army in World War I and saw the horrors of war up close and became a pacifist. And so when the Nazis came into being, he saw where it was headed, and he too opposed, through the confessing church, the development of the Nazi ideology. He was imprisoned early on, mid-30s, and lived throughout the whole war in prison and survived, unlike Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was somewhat more involved in the resistance and who ended up being hanged just before the forces of liberation arrived in 1945. Anyway, the confessing church raised some very important issues about Christian understanding of power and race and ideology and government, which the leaders, the theologians over here heard and began to take seriously in their teaching of people like me, young pastors, young students in the 50s. And among them, I don't know, you probably heard of Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. These were two professors in New York City who were very much involved in this re-examination of what was going on in the world and helping the churches in this country face up to what we really hadn't taken very seriously. There is a quote at the end of your outline. I don't have that right. I have a quote with me, but it's on the second page of your outline today that I'm going through here. And I neglected to say that this was a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. What got on your page is the fact that I found it in a book about George Kennan, who was at one time our ambassador to the Soviet Union and a very great statesman. And he obviously had been influenced by Niebuhr, but listen to this quote: "The gospel cannot be preached with truth and power if it does not challenge the pretensions and pride not only of intellectuals, but of nations, cultures, civilizations, and economic and political systems. The good fortune of America and its power place it under the most grievous temptations to self-adulation." Now, there's a mouthful in two sentences. But Niebuhr was a very powerful speaker. I'll be a little autobiographical here. I heard him speak when I was an undergraduate in college. I had the faintest idea what he was talking about. One of his students, who was later a professor that I took for a course, said Reinhold Niebuhr had a way of lecturing like a man fighting a swarm of bees. And that's kind of the way I felt after hearing him the first time. Okay, I was maybe 20 when I heard him. And I just didn't have enough background to understand what he was talking about. Then, in my 30s, I took some graduate courses and read heavily in Reinhold Niebuhr's writings. I thought, wow, this man knows what he's talking about. That wasn't Niebuhr, he hadn't changed, but I had changed in that 10 or 12 years, and my eyes have been open to a lot of things I wasn't aware of. So he was a very influential person in not only the young pastors and theologians of the churches, including the Lutheran Church, but he also had a significant influence on many politicians, like George Kennan. So he had a profound influence, and it's good to know that. But he was an example of what we've come to understand better in the Lutheran Church. Now, I've talked about the confessing church, but just to say where this helped lead us in the Lutheran Church in this country was, I guess, the simplest way to put it, a renewed appreciation of the first commandment: you shall have no other gods before me. And how easy it is, especially in a society, to set up false gods. Niebuhr had written a book back in the 30s, before World War II, called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And his whole thesis was that, yeah, we individuals can get immoral, but when you get the collectives in society, whether they be corporations or churches or other organizations or governments, they are the worst problem when they take on the trappings of ideology and full knowledge of everything and power and wealth. They just can run all over everybody, unlike individuals. So moral man, immoral society, the collectives of society can be the biggest problem, was the point of the book. And that was very influential too, and World War II, I think, bore that out, because we could see that that's, at least in part, what happened in Germany. So there was a growing sense in this country, I'd say in the 50s, that racism and extreme nationalism become idolatrous, or can become idolatrous, because they replace the one true God with some other human construct that says we have all the answers and we know what you should believe and how you should act, and you do it our way. There was also, I could call it a renewed sense, but for many of us it was a new sense that the church had the task to oppose such ideologies and idolatries and overextension of human knowledge and power. That it wasn't just enough to treat the victims of these things, but to say, wait a minute, what's causing these problems? Like the people in the town decide finally to go upriver and say, ooh, something up there is causing this. So that was growing. Now on the positive side, there was also, with this, a newer sense, I think, that Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament, is very heavily about community and sharing and equity among people, so that we look to a new community in the church, certainly, but also, hopefully, spreading out into the society. And that part of our task is to speak about the importance of the whole community and the whole community caring for everyone else in community. And so we need to address these community issues and not just the victims of injustice or poverty or whatever. So that was partially what came out of World War II. Any comments or questions up to that point before I move on?
Could you spell the last name of Reinhold?
Niebuhr, N-I-E-B-U-H-R. He had a brother who was also somewhat influential. What the heck was his brother's name?
Richard.
Richard Niebuhr, yeah, right. He taught at Yale. Reinhold taught at Union Seminary in New York City. But Reinhold was more influential than Richard, but they made quite a pair between them. I don't know whether their parents lived long enough to experience that. I wonder what it'd be like to have two sons like Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr. I can't imagine it. Well, if you're ready, I want to move on to what I think was the second major influence during these years on the church, and that was the Civil Rights Movement. Now, a lot of you remember the Civil Rights Movement, I'm sure. It was revelatory, I think, to the church to begin with, late 50s, early 60s. It was revelatory to me. Now, come on, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, you know? You think of that as a melting pot, don't you? Yeah, most people do. I lived in an all-white area, lots of Jews around, learned a lot about Jewish people, but no black people, no African Americans or Asian Americans or Hispanic Americans. It was all white people, Northern Europeans like me. And the church, the first church I served in Syracuse, New York, was a blue-collar church, so I got to see, you know, people of different economic status and so on, but all white, and located in an all-white part of the city. So when these civil rights activists started revealing to us what was going on in our society under the surface, or even in the South, above the surface, to me, and I have to guess, to most people like me, and that meant most Lutherans, was, oh, wow, I didn't know this stuff was happening. I recall going in Syracuse to some kind of a public meeting where a couple of the civil rights workers from the South came to talk about their experiences. And my jaw dropped. Just hearing about the voter restrictions, the sharecropping, the lack of facilities for non-white people. I didn't know that stuff was going on in our country. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And my first attempts to try to deal with this publicly with people in my congregation got chopped right off because I didn't know enough to know what I was saying or doing. And so the people I tried talking to knew a lot more than I did. So I think I was fairly typical of Lutherans and even the leadership of the Lutheran Church. dealing with something we had not understood. Now, there were people like Pastor Joe Ellwanger, a lot of you know him, who served churches in the South who saw it up close and personal, who knew early on what was happening racially in this country. But for me, the civil rights movement, and I think for our church in general, was a real wake-up call. Now, the interesting thing, I think, in the context we're talking about is this came right out of the Christian church, the black church, especially the Southern Baptist church that Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and other leaders were a part of. Somehow, well, it's clearer than somehow. From the early days of the African American churches, they knew there was a problem with justice in this country, and they knew that biblically justice was a very important category. That the prophets had talked about justice and called the leadership of the Israelites to overcome injustice and to treat people fairly, and especially those who were least in the society in those days, the widows, the orphans, and the sojourners, which we would call immigrants today, that they needed to be treated with justice. That was long a part of the understanding and preaching in the black churches, but we didn't know that, did we, in the white churches? So this led us very much to the leadership of the civil rights movement, that, hey, we have a message which is from God, that there should be justice in the land, and that people should be treated fairly, and here are all these injustices that need to be overcome. Oh, I meant to say earlier, before Carl leaves, when I talked about the Augustana Church being one of the churches that joined the LCA, they had a strong influence on social justice, and I'm surprised you didn't say
We're
that.
having a personal conversation. We'll do it later.
But
Unfortunately, I got a
but this-
commitment. I'd love to stay.
Yeah, that's fine. For reasons I don't understand, the Swedish Lutherans in this country had a better sense of justice than most of the rest of us, and so I meant to say that earlier. Because Carl comes out of that tradition. Okay, back to the civil rights movement. I think one of the things, again, that the civil rights movement did for us in the Lutheran Church is drive us back to the Bible. We were good on the New Testament, all about Jesus Christ and redemption and forgiveness and grace and so on. But we weren't as much into the Old Testament as some of the other Christian churches were, at least speaking for myself and remembering my seminary training and knowing other pastors and so on. And it helped us realize there's more to Scripture than just the New Testament. The New Testament fulfills the Old Testament, but it also presupposes the Old Testament. And we need to not forget that. Yes?
What does that mean, that it presupposes the
Oh,
Old Testament?
well, that the early Christians, the writers of the New Testament, for them, the only scriptures they had were what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. And so when they wrote and spoke and preached and so on, they were largely speaking out of the context of the Old Testament, because that was their scripture. They didn't have any idea. Paul, when he wrote his letters to the various churches, he had no idea someday the Christian church is going to say, oh, this is scripture now. So we had kind of, I think in the Lutheran Church, belittled the Old Testament and said, oh, it's the New Testament that's really important. And it is. However, the strong emphasis on the Old Testament is on social justice. Whenever the Israelites got involved either in misusing poor people and vulnerable people, the prophets spoke up. And in the Psalms, the writers of the Psalms also speak often of the need for justice. When the kings entered into alliances with other kings in order to wage war, the prophets called them to take task that that's not the way God wanted to run society. Various ways like that. There's so many examples that could be given. A friend of mine, Bruce Malco, some of you may know him, he's a Lutheran pastor, now retired, has even written a book titled Justice in the Hebrew Scriptures. And he goes through quite extensively the components of the Hebrew Scriptures, the early writings, what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the history, the historical books, the Psalms, the prophets, the wisdom literature. And he illustrates in every case how there was a strong emphasis there on the need for people who cared about God in their lives and in other people's lives to be concerned about justice. That had not been a very strong theme in the Lutheran Church up until that time. But out of the civil rights movement, we realized these are societal, these are, what's the right word? These are issues that affect us all. And so they need to be addressed. And the church hadn't been doing it. Well, it's very interesting to me that the leadership of the Lutheran Church in America, LCA, began to realize this too. And so they decided we need to study and wrestle with issues like civil rights. And we need to adopt some kinds of statements of guidance for the members of the church. So the very first social statement of a Lutheran church in this country, at least that I'm aware of, occurred in 1962, and it was directed at the civil rights concerns. Now, I have to say that social statements in the Lutheran Church need to be understood in their context. They are not doctrine. They are not promulgated to say, this is what you must believe if you're going to be a Lutheran. It's not like Roman Catholic Church issuing an ex cathedra statement. That's very important that we understand that. This is for the guidance of the church. Secondly, they are developed very democratically, and this still goes on. There are materials sent out to lots of congregations to study in their own context and then send back comments and suggestions to a commission that gathers all this, and then they work up a preliminary statement which then gets further discussion and consideration, and it finally comes to an assembly of the whole church to vote on, so that there is a democratic process by which it's finally adopted. And it offers guidance not only to us as individual Christians, but to the various aspects of the Lutheran Church. The congregations, the synods, the social service organizations of the church, the national staff, all these people are getting some guidance about how they should carry out their work, their ministry, in the light of the issue that's being considered. Now I'll get a little autobiographical again. I don't know, these things bring back memories and they're interesting to me, so I like to share them. That first statement that came out on racial justice, at the time in the congregation I was serving in Syracuse, there was a social ministry committee, or I'm not sure dollar whether we called it that, but that's what it was. And so we took that up and read it, and the members of the committee said, this is important stuff. We got to share this with the congregation. So they worked out a plan, got me to agree to it, that on a given Sunday, I would not have a sermon, but they would, as a committee, lead a discussion with the congregation right there in a sanctuary on aspects of this statement. So they did that. And of course, the people were quite surprised by this. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Number one, the pastor gave up the sermon. Number two, they had a discussion in church. But it was quite interesting. Some people appreciated it. There was one man, I remember vividly, got up and walked out. And he was in my office first thing the next morning complaining. And he was a man I had admired. He was an assistant district attorney in the county. And he had done some very good things in that role. But when he came into my office and started talking, it became very clear to me this was an awful racist. He recalled, I don't know when or where, how he had gunned down some African American people in a riot and was glad to have done it. I mean, oh. And he left the congregation as a result, and I thought, yeah, that's okay. I don't think we need that kind of attitude around. But that's just to give you a little flavor of the first one of these statements that has come out. Since then, not only the LCA and the ALC adopted other statements, but the ELCA adopts them too. I think the most recent one is on criminal justice. And there's actually a meeting this afternoon at Jackson Park Church on the south side. It's going to be talking about that subject, and that statement will probably be, or at least a study guide for the statement will be a topic of discussion. So that was quite influential on the church. It influenced me to get involved in some demonstrations, which I had never dreamed possible. And in the mid-60s, I was interviewing at a church in Philadelphia as a possible call to go there. One of the things they wanted was an assurance I would never participate in any demonstration. I said, I'm sorry, I can't make that promise. And you can guess the result. I never went to Philadelphia. But these were things that were happening, and not only to me. I speak personally to give you a flavor of it, but to other pastors and to leaders in the congregation and synod and the national church. Before I move on then to the third thing I want to cover, is there anything you'd like to bring up on civil rights? Still a matter of concern, but then these all, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, I think we all know this, but there's such a strange idea about what the term justice means in our society today. And, so many people just hear justice and they think of punishment. And they don't even understand this whole concept, fairness and equity.
Yeah, right. Well, you're absolutely right that, and the discussion in this week's Time magazine about the aftermath of the killing of those African Americans in Charleston last spring is very interesting. I didn't get through it all, but it talks about what some feel is justice and what others feel is justice in terms of the perpetrator. So that's true. However, justice in the Bible generally means taking care of those that are pressed down and underprivileged and open to exploitation. But generally, if we're talking about it biblically, that's it. Yeah. Right.
I was just going to mention in Reformation during I think it was the Synod had a justice and social change movement.
Yes.
And I was part of that.
Uh-huh.
And it was all, again, a very eye-opening
Yes.
affair to see
Yeah.
what happened when you were part of a minority
Yeah, right. Could you all hear that?
No.
He said that at Reformation Church in the 60s, there was a justice and social change effort, and he was a part of it, and it was very eye-opening, as I'm saying too. But that shows that it was happening in at least some congregations, and people were learning things they didn't know before, and trying to respond in Christian ways. What were you
Well, I
gonna
was
say?
just gonna say, in response to what you said, in terms of people, and I agree with you, people oftentimes do think that, justice means punishment. Well, if you think about liberty and justice for all, does that mean liberty and punishment for all?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, you gotta look at it broadly.
But you can understand if you have a loved one who's murdered, to the grieving family, what is justice? And so emotionally, you can see the other side of that too, yeah.
Aren't there gonna be some that say, well, what about the parts of the Bible that say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth?
Oh, I'm gonna get to that. That's very good though, because, well, just to respond specifically to that, when that got promulgated in the Old Testament, it was an improvement over the old codes of law, which had preceded the Hebrew people, which said if someone in your family is killed, you can slaughter the whole family that did it. So it was an attempt to say, wait a minute, there's got to be a balance here. No more than one eye for another eye. Or if someone put out your eye, you don't have a right to kill them. So while it sounds kind of brutal to us,
Yeah.
at the time, it was intended to move things to a fairer place. So it's good to know that.
To add, too, I think just simply awareness is a big concept, and I think about what Bob said. Our Senate is still involved in anti-racism workshops. It's an ongoing awareness, and
Yes.
having gone through that, it is an eye-opener.
Right. Yes, and learning about things that, in spite of all this involvement I had in civil rights, I never really knew or thought about until recent years, white privilege. What's that? Privilege just by being white? Well, when you get down to it, yes. So yes, there's things we still have to learn and respond to. But if it's okay, I'll move on to the little subject of Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah. We get it deeper and deeper here, don't we? Okay, that came also as a huge influence, not only on the church, but the society. You recall that we went in there in the early 60s and got more and more and more involved in the mid-60s and thereafter. And what I'm saying in my outline is that it created an awareness that I don't think had been there before of the danger of national hubris. I don't know if that's a term you're familiar with. It basically means pride against others. And I'm not going to review the whole history, but the reason that those of us who studied the history, I didn't even know where Vietnam was when it first happened. So like everybody else, I was pretty ignorant, but I tried to do my homework. And what we learned was the United States had followed the French, who had been colonial exploiters before World War II. When they finally gave up the fight, because the Vietnamese had driven them out, then we went in. And supposedly to try to have an even settlement of things, because North Vietnam had a lot of Roman Catholics living there, and they didn't like the communist bent of the government, so they moved to South Vietnam. And a treaty was set up to which our government agreed that going to be time to let things cool off, and then peacefully there was going to be some kind of agreement to try to reunite Vietnam. Well, our government went in and set up a puppet government in South Vietnam, which of course did not want to give up power and get reunited with the North, and so on and so forth. And that's not the whole story, but it's part of it. And it just, once we learned that, we discovered, you know, our government hasn't got clean hands on this thing. And then as the violence progressed, and we unilaterally involved Laos and Cambodia and dropped more tonnage of bombs than in all of World War II. I mean, just all kinds of things came out that led to this questioning of national pride and hubris that would make us think we have a right to do that. Now, at the time, I was a campus pastor in northern Idaho, University of Idaho. So believe me, I saw up close what the young people were going through with this, trying to decide whether their role was to be drafted or enlist or to refuse on grounds of conscience, and heard it all. But we were in the midst of their struggles, and they were the ones that had to struggle with these issues because their lives were on the line. So it was an intense time of ministry for me. And I'll be autobiographical again because it's kind of a funny story that comes out of this. My wife and our kids, our son Ron right here, I don't know, did you take part in any of the demonstrations with us? Do you remember?
In Idaho?
Yeah, in Idaho.
We were 14 when I left, no.
Well, we got the younger kids. We had the younger kids out there on the line with us.
I don't remember doing that.
No, you probably were old enough to say, no, I'm not going to do that. But the younger ones, they went with us. Anyway, I participated in some anti-war demonstrations. Well, one of the members of the Lutheran Church in town learned about that. He had a son who was a student at the university, and I don't know if the son told him what. But he was very incensed that a Lutheran pastor would be publicly opposing what the government was doing. So here's the funny part. He came to my office and he told me face to face, which is to his credit, what he thought of my action and that I wasn't suitable to be a pastor for the students. So he wanted to know who to write to get me fired. I thought, well, that's interesting. So I gave him the name of the national director for Lutheran Campus Ministry, which was in Chicago. And sure enough, he wrote to this guy and explained why he thought I should be fired as a campus pastor. Well, a few weeks later, he's back in my office with a letter he got back from the director saying, first of all, I had every right as an American citizen to voice my opinion publicly. But secondly, as a Christian, he happened to agree with me. We had no business being over there, and he goes into a long dissertation about the evils of that war. Well, now the guy doesn't care about me anymore. I'm small fry. He wants to get this executive. Who do I write to get him fired? So you never know what's going to happen. And I gave him the names of the church leaders, and he wrote to them, but from what I understand, they didn't bother to answer. But that was a period that I went through, in which the church went through, and especially those of us in campus ministry went through, because it was right up close to our faces. I'm not going to have time to do everything I want here, so I'm going to pick up on some of this at the beginning of next week. But I will say that it led us to take a look once again at Scripture and to take seriously what Jesus said. Now, Jesus wasn't talking to governments. We admit that, we acknowledge that. But he did so clearly support nonviolence, love your enemies, do good to those who mistreat you. if you're on your way to a court case with your opponent, don't go into court. Settle it between you. Don't get into the kind of hassling that goes on there. Just various parables and teachings of Jesus call into question the response of violence when there are disputes. Now, there's no question there are disputes that have to be dealt with, but we had to re-examine those things, which I think happened not only in campus ministry, but also in congregations. And here was another thing that we re-examined, was the early history of the Christian church. What we know is that the first Christians refused to serve in armies, and that they were advised by their leaders not to do that. Partly that was because they were Roman armies, and the Romans were looked upon as oppressors. But it was also an attempt to live out the non-violent ethic of Jesus, to take seriously, love your enemies, do not hate them. And that actually was the tradition of the Christian church, pretty much, not universally, that Christians just didn't sign up for armies until Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then all of a sudden it was fruit cart upset. And now, we're a part of the establishment. Oh, well, how does that make things look different? And from that time on, there was much more engagement of Christians in armies and military combat and so on. But what I don't have time to get into, and which I want to take some time to talk about, is eventually what grew up was known as the just war theory. One of the early exponents of that was St. Augustine. So this was now the 4th century after Christianity was the official religion. And there's I don't know, have you all heard of the just war theory? Some haven't, I bet. Because it never gets talked about in our church, does it? It did in those days, back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, but it's kind of been put under the other things by now. But I think it's important that we know about it and know what it is and, take it seriously. So I'd like to begin there next week. I'm sorry if there's some of you who won't be here. But I don't feel we have time to really discuss it thoroughly.
Give us
now.
like a brief overview of it, just quick.
Well, it says that basically there should be no wars unless certain conditions are met. And if you take the whole thing, there are 7 conditions. And I'll tell you another funny story. During my days in campus ministry, I went to a student conference, and the speaker at that conference was a theologian from the Mennonite Church, which is one of the peace churches. And he talked about the just war theory. He said, I would have some appreciation for the just war theory if only there was a church somewhere, sometime, that had said a certain war was unjust. And boy, he hit the nail right on the head. I mean, yeah, we've got that there in our history and theoretically in our teaching ministry, but it never gets used. And so he was saying, what good is it if it never gets paid any attention to? So that's why I want to spend some time on it next week. Okay?
Thank you.
Questions, comments? We certainly have time for 1 or 2. Okay. See you next week, I hope. We'll go on. Oh, you can see what I'm going to talk about next week. I'll start out with the just war theory, but then I want to talk about feminism, economics, and ecology. 3 minor subjects.
What?